Hey everybody, you're watching ASMR Angel Reads. We're continuing chapter 5 of Daggerspell. The last section of chapter 5 had Rodri's brother, who was the king, come down to visit Rodri's mother to talk about a upcoming war that might be happening. And also, he can't bear sons with his wife, so he's casting her off. And Rodri's mother said she would take care of her. So continue. Much to Jill's delight, it took Dragged some days to finish trading with the wild folk. One at a time, either a man or a woman would lead a horse over and sit down in the grass to haggle leisurely with the merchant. When that deal was done, an hour or two would pass before the next horse made its appearance. Since most of the West folk knew no Devrian, the man named Genantar stayed with Dragged to translate. In her self-appointed role as Dragged's assistant, Jill came to know him fairly well. The second afternoon, during a break in the trading, Cullen came over and insisted that Jill take a walk with him down by the river. I wish to every god and his wife that you wouldn't spend so much time hanging around Dragged. I know cursed well it's the stinking West folks you want to talk with. I just don't see what you have against them. They're not animals. Look at their clothes and their jewelry. And then they built that bridge over the river. Somewhere they must have had farms and cities and such likes. Indeed, and I suppose you'll like to ride off with that Genantar and take a look at them? What? You're daft. He's got a wife and a baby, and he's never said one wrong word to me. Oh, horse shit. There's more than one man in the world who's had a wife and didn't mind having a pretty lass, too. I don't even know what to say to you when your temper takes you this way. Cullen stopped walking, turning a little bit to look out over the endless green of grasslands, and his mouth went slack and weary. Jill laid a hand on his arm. Please, what's so wrong? Oh, may the gods blast me if I even know, my sweet. It aches my heart being out here. For years I thought it was the edge of nowhere, and now I find out there's this dismal, strange folk riding around out here, and they've been here all along. And he shrugged in inarticulate frustration. And, well, you're going to think me daft, curse it, but they stink of Dwemer and witchcraft. Does that Addern fellow? Jill couldn't have been more shocked if a performing bear in the marketplace had suddenly started declaiming a bard's song. Her stolid warrior of a father talking of Dwemer. Well, Colin snapped, I said it sounds daft. It doesn't, truly, I think you're right. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded as if he'd been waiting for her judgment upon the matter. Jill felt a cold streak down her back. As if to mock her, the gray gnome popped into manifestation nearby, grinned at her, and then vanished again. I'd never leave you. If you thought I would, then truly you were daft. Cullen relaxed, smiling at her softly. Well and good then, my sweet, he said. My apologies. You can watch our merchant haggle if you want to. We'll be getting out of here soon enough. Jill took him up on his offer and went back to the trading. When she sat down beside Genantar, he raised a quizzical eyebrow. Doesn't your father think I'm fit company for you? Jill merely shrugged. He started to say more and then suddenly jumped to his feet with an oath for trouble brewing. Two of the West folk were arguing with a frightened Dragged, who was clasping the last remaining sword of the Lungcorn steel, and Jill followed Genantar over. She heard them arguing about buying it. Now here, Dragged snapped, I never promised it to either of you. The two men looked only at each other in anger, the more frightening because it played over such beautiful faces. Jill, Genantar hissed, go fetch Addern quickly. Without thinking, Jill ran to the West folks' camp. At the edge, she stopped suddenly, bewildered by the profusion of bright colors, the gaggle of children and dogs, and the unfamiliar language that swirled around her. A few at a time, West folks strolled over and surrounded her. When a dog growled, she stepped back sharply. Addern, Jill said. Janitor told me to get Addern. The people merely looked at her. Please, Jill tried again. Where's Addern? They glanced at each other, their cat-slit eyes totally expressionless. Jill felt a little flutter of panic round her heart. All of them, even the women, were wearing long knives at their belts. Please, Janitor told me to come here. One man glanced her way, but he said nothing. Jill wanted to turn and run, but they were standing close behind her, too. Then she heard Addern's voice calling out in their language, and the crowd parted to let him through. Janitor said to fetch you, Jill said. A couple of your lads are fighting over somewhat. Addern swore under his breath. The camp, which only a moment before had seemed to understand not one word she said, muttered and swore at the news. Addern grabbed Jill's arm and hurried her across the meadow, surprisingly fast for such an old man. When she glanced back, she saw the crowd trailing after them. Back by the trade goods, Janitor stood between the two who wanted the sword, while Dragged hovered nearby, clutching the sheathed blade in nervous fingers. As soon as they saw Addern, all three men of the West folk began to yell at the top of their lungs. Jill hurried over to Dragged. They're like this at times, he said in a resigned tone of voice. I'm glad the old man's here to settle things. Yet it seemed that Addern's efforts to do just that were proving futile. All the time that he talked in a soothing, patient voice, the two went on staring at each other, arms crossed right over their chest, cat-slit eyes unblinking. With the shake of his head, Janitor left the bad job to the old man and joined Jill. Around them, the crowd grew, West folk and muleteers alike. A wild folk popped into manifestation in droves, grinning so hard that they bared pointed teeth. They've hated each other for years, Janitor remarked. They're not going to listen now. Eventually, he proved right. Addern threw his hands in the air and returned to the crowd of West folk, who stamped their feet on the ground in sharp rhythm. The two men slowly and methodically slipped off their tunics and tossed them to the ground, then drew their knives, which were about a foot long and slightly curved on one of the blades. The blades winked in the sun as the pair dropped into a fighting crouch. Jill felt sick, wondering if she was going to see a man killed right in front of her. In dead silence, the pair circled around one another, their strange eyes narrow, their jaws set. There was none of the ritual boasting and yelling that would have accompanied a fight between two Devery men. Just the quiet animals circling. A few quick feigns, a few quick withdrawals, while the sweat sprang up on their bare backs and made their pale skin glisten. Around and around they went until one made a charge and the other held his ground. A quick scuffle, too quick to see, and one fell back with his arm gashed open from elbow to shoulder. Dragged swore, but the watching crowd of West folk merely stamped on the ground again and briefly. Addern ran to separate the combatants, who fell back willingly. It's just to the first blood, Jill said. It is, Janitor said. My apologies, I forgot you didn't know. The bloody knife still in his hand, the victor strolled over to Dragged, who handed him the sword without a word. His head bowed, the loser stood alone, slumped in defeat, and let the blood run down his arm until Addern grabbed him and forcefully hauled him away. So much for that, Janitor remarked, until the next time they find somewhat that annoys them. One of these days the first blood is going to be someone's throat. When Jill looked at the man she'd been thinking of as a friend, she was caught all over again by his alienness as his smoky, slit eyes stared back unblinkingly. They truly are kin to the wild folks, she thought, and not for the first time. She wondered if her father were right to think them dangerous. That night she listened to the music wailing from the Westfolk camp. She was glad to be sitting by the fire with her own kind. By sunset of the third day, Dragged had 12 western hunters in his herd, including the golden stud that he particularly wanted. And it was a good thing, too, because Jenitar abruptly announced that no one else wanted to trade with him. Dragged made no attempt to argue with the news, merely walked away to tell the men that they would be riding out on the morrow. "I'll be going with you," Jenitar remarked to Jill. "Addern's taking the three of us along for guard." "I don't blame him. I met this Lane, and I wouldn't trust him with a copper, much less my life. Well, if you lay your complaint with the Tyrant, she'll haul him into her malover for you." "Her what? I've never heard of that word." "Malover. It's when someone feels wronged and asks the Tyrant or Gorbert to judge the matter. The priests of Bel come too because they know all the laws." "Oh, well and good then. No doubt Addern knows all the right things to say." At dawn the next day the caravan prepared for the long march back to Eldad. In the cool gray morning the mules brayed in protest as the yawning men loaded up the last of the trade goods and the provisions Dragon had obtained from the Westfolk. Jill was helping rope the riderless horses together with when Addern rode up with his guards. Jenitar and then two men he introduced as Calandril and Alberal. Jenitar led a horse that was dragging a loaded travois. "Come ride at the head of the line with me and Jill," Draggett said to the old man. "I'll put your men in the rear with Cullen on guard, and if you don't mind." "You're the caravan master," Addern said, smiling. "We ride at your orders." Since they were heading for Canabane, the caravan took a different route back. The first day, Dragged led them straight south through the long grasslands. Once they saw at a great distance the tiny figures, mounted riders and riderless horses heading west, like a ship seen across a green ocean. But if that clan of Westfolk saw the caravan, they gave no sign. Jill found herself wondering what it would be like to ride endlessly from nowhere to nowhere, always free like a falcon in the skies. She had such a life herself, but she knew with a bitter certainty that someday her wandering would end. At times she dropped back to ride beside Cullen, and she would notice the gray sprinkled in his hair and the web of fine lines around his eyes. The day was coming when some younger man would bring his weird to him in battle. The thought brought such panic that at times it was hard to breathe. On the second day the caravan turned east. Here and there they came to magnificent stands of forest, but Dragon knew his route well and led them from the wild meadow to the wild meadow. Once the track passed through straggly young beeches and alders that had to be second growth forest, and on the other side was land that had been plowed. Packed flint walls still stood, making out long gone fields. In pastures Jill saw tumbled down stone sheds and white cattle gone wild, and as suspicious as deer. Since she was riding next to Addern, she asked him if the Westfolk had once farmed there. "Not the Westfolk, but the Eldon men," Addern said. "A long, long time ago it was, but some of the younger sons of the Elded Lord tried to colonize out here. It was too far west and they couldn't keep their holdings." "And was there trouble with the Westfolk over it?" "Trouble and twice trouble. The Westfolk used to roam much farther east than they do now, and they felt they'd given up enough land. Here I never heard of any tales about that. It was a very long time ago, and Elded men have forgotten. They've worked at forgetting truly, but haven't you ever wondered about the names of the rivers? The the Delendrel. Those aren't Devry words, child." "Of course, Delendril like Calandril." "Just so, and Eldad was called El Tadina a long time ago when Deverymen first sailed here. Adern thought for a moment. That was 800 or so years ago, if I remember rightly. It has been a long time since I studied such things. Soon Dragged called for the halt for the night's camp, where a stone wall marked out what had once been a field, and scrubby trees grew all along the stream. They tethered out the horses and mules and made their camp. Over dinner, Dragged discussed the route ahead. This stream turns into a river farther south. We'll follow it down to the coast, then turn east and march along the sea cliffs to Cannabin. There's plenty of fodder along there for the stock. I'd say we're a good 2 days out, so let's hope this dry weather holds. Jill felt a sudden coldness along her back as if someone had stroked her spine with a clammy hand. She was sure that worse trouble than a possible rainstorm lay ahead, although she tried to talk herself out of the feeling. Late that night when she was trying to get sleep, the gray gnome appeared. He was troubled too, pulling at her shirt and pointing off to the east, and opening his mouth in little soundless whimpers. Finally, Jill got up and followed him to the edge of the sleeping camp. He jumped up and down, always pointing to the east. I don't see anything. He clutched his head in agony and promptly disappeared. Jill went back to her bedroll. Except for occasional drowsy stamp of a horse or a mule, the night was utterly quiet. Once she heard the cry of an owl and looked up to see a tiny dark shape of the bird flying against the stars. She dozed off to have troubled dreams that the enormous owl flew overhead, calling out warnings of danger. Just at dawn, she woke with a start, and the gnome was pulling her hair. Oh, all right, let me get my boots on, and then you can try to show me again. The gnome led her down to the stream where a giant among the twisted willows stood one old oak. He danced around and pointed to the tree. When Jill looked up, she saw Adern in the branches. He gave her a sheepish smile, and then he climbed down as nimble as a lad. I've been keeping a watch, Adern said, and Jill could see that he was deeply troubled. We're in grave danger, child. Hurry, go wake your father. Together they ran back to the waking camp. The men were getting up and stretching. The horses and mules were starting to graze. Jill found Cullen just pulling on his boots. Dad, come with me. Adern says there's trouble ahead. Cullen got up and grabbed his sword belt from the ground. He buckled it on as they ran across the camp to find Adern arguing with Dragged, who looked utterly baffled. You've known me for years, Adern was saying. Please, my friend, you've got to trust me now. I do, but how in the hells can you know? I've never had any trouble with bandits out here, and now you say that there's a whole pack of them waiting in ambush? Doesn't make any blasted sense. I can know, and I do know. We've got to do something or we'll all be slaughtered on the road. From the look of Dragon's face, it was obvious that he thought the old man had gone completely daft. Suddenly mad, Adern leaned forward and stared into his eyes. The look of disbelief vanished. Of course, Dragon said, I'll do whatever you say. For a moment, Jill's hand shook. Against all reason, he knew that she'd just seen the man enscrolled. When Adern glanced her way, she ducked her head and refused to look at him. He laughed softly, acknowledging the gesture. Cullen, he said, do you believe me? I do, and I don't care how you scribe them out either. It was Adern's turn to be startled. Cullen gave him a weary sort of smile. Many of them. How many of them are there? At least 30, and they seem to be as well armed as a lord's warband. Dragged turned dead white. Frightened muleteers clustered around to whisper the news among themselves. We've got to have shelter. Cullen looked as bored and lazy as if he were asking for ale at a tavern. The muleteers have quarterstaffs, but they can't use them if they're being ridden down by men on horseback. A patch of forest, rocks, anything to make them attack on foot. Adern hesitated, thinking hard. Here, Jill broke in. If there were lords out here once, they must have had duns. Are there still any standing? Of course, Adern said. Forgive me, I know nothing of matters of war. There's one about 5 miles or so to the south and west. The walls are still there the last time I passed by. Splendid, Colin said. We might be able to hold them off long enough for Jill to get back from Canabane with some of the Tyrann's men. What? Jill snapped. You can't send me away. Colin slapped her across the face so hard she staggered. You follow orders. What's 2 days' ride for a lot of stinking muleteers would be one for a rider with a spare horse to share her weight. You're riding to the Tyrann and begging for aid. Do you hear me? I do. Jill rubbed her achy cheek, but you'd best be alive when I ride back. The way Colin smiled, a cold twitch of his mouth told Jill that he doubted he would be. For a moment she thought that her body had turned to water and that she was going to float away and dissolve like one of the wild folk. Colin grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. You're riding for the life of every man in this caravan. Do you understand me? I do. I'll take 2 of the hunters. They're the best horses we've got. Genitar saddled one horse and put the other on a lead rope. Then he held the bridle as Jill swung herself up. As she bent over to take the lead rope, their eyes met. I'll see you on the morrow, Genitar said. I'll pray that's true. Oh, we've got a trick or two to play on these piss-pot bandits. We'll hold them off. All at once, Genitar flung his hands over his head and danced. Just a few quick steps to some unsung music, and he was grinning like a fiend. Seeing him so battle-eager was one of the strangest things on this strange day. If you listened this long, thank you. If you could please subscribe and share and get me out there, I'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Bye.